Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wild Writers Literary Festival. This is our 10th year, and this is our last day of this year's festival, so I'm really happy that you're able to make it today for this event with Jean McNeil and Kathleen Winter. This year's festival, as ever, is brought to you by the new quarterly literary magazine, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and Wordsworth Books. And I'd like to thank our sponsors and donors, and especially the Ontario Arts Council, the NAP Wealth Management Team of RBC Dominion Securities, and Audie Kitchener-Waterloo. Thank you very much for your support. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, Alysia Kolentsis, who is an associate professor of English at St. Jerome's University at the University of Waterloo. Over to you, Alysia.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I'm delighted to be here on this Sunday afternoon, and I think in non-pandemic times, this is typically a brunch event, so I hope that some of you have coffees or mimosas or some other brunch treat in hand. It's my pleasure to be here with two remarkable writers, Jean McNeil and Kathleen Winter, to discuss their latest novels, both of which take on the formidable forces of time and history. So our plan for this event is as follows. I'll introduce both of our panelists. I'll invite them to talk a bit about their books and do a reading, and then we'll launch into our conversation. And for those of you in the audience, as questions occur to you, please type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And during the last 15 minutes, we'll have time to pose these questions to Kathleen and Jean. And for Jean and Kathleen, I have some questions that are specifically tailored to your respective novels and more general ones, but of course, feel free to jump in at any point if a question speaks to you or if you'd like to explore a particular topic in greater detail. Jean McNeil is the author of 14 books of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and travel. She has twice been the winner of the PRISM International competition, and her work has been shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award, the Journey Prize, the National Magazine Awards, and the Pushcart Prize. In 2016, her memoir and travelogue, based on her year as a writer in residence with the British Antarctic Survey, Diaries, won the Adventure, Travel, and Grand Prizes at the Banff Mountain Film and Book Festival. And it was named one of the best nature writing books by the Guardian newspaper in 2018. Jean is professor of creative writing at the University of East Anglia. Originally from Nova Scotia, she lives in London, England. Kathleen Winter's novel, Annabelle, was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Governor General's Literary Award, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, the Amazon.ca First Novel Award, the Orange Prize, and numerous other awards. It was also a Globe and Mail Best Book, a New York Times Notable Book, a Quill and Quire Book of the Year, and a #1 bestseller in Canada. It has been published and translated worldwide. Her Arctic memoir, Boundless, was shortlisted for Canada's Weston and Taylor Nonfiction Prizes, and her last novel, Lost in September, was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award and was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. Born in the UK, Kathleen now lives in Montreal and the Eastern Townships after many years in Newfoundland. So as you can glean from these speaker bios, we have a number of interesting points of connection and intersection between our speakers. Aside from being decorated writers, they both have roots and histories in the Maritimes as well as the UK. They seem to share a wanderlust, especially perhaps for polar regions, and they are risk takers in their work. The novels that we're focusing on today, Kathleen's Undersong and Jean's Day for Night, each feature characters drawn from real life, so historic figures who come with an existing backstory to reckon with. So I'm going to pass the baton over to them for a moment. Let's begin with Jean McNeil. Jean, could you tell us a bit about the genesis of Day for Night and then read a little bit from the novel?
Yeah, thanks, Alysia, and hi, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. So by the way, I'm speaking from London, so it's dark. It's yeah, dark and cold. And actually, that's relevant to the novel. I began the novel in January 2018 when it was predictably dark and cold, I sort of began it, I think, as a personal project, in that it's not everything that I write that I feel I will eventually inflict upon the world. You know, sometimes I just write for myself. And I often write to keep myself company, especially in dark times, like politically dark times, I'm referring to, rather than kind of, you know, seasonally. And so that metaphor was in my mind, a sort of darkness and a companionship. And I decided to write a novel that would actually track through time. Other writers have done this, notably Ali Smith. Quite recently, she's written a quartet which follow the seasons in so-called real time, referring to events. But I'd never really done that before as a writer, and I wasn't sure it was going to work. So I decided to write, and just everything that happened to me, I put in the novel in fictional terms, and everything that was happening in the world, and especially in Britain at that point, also fueled the narrative. So yeah, it was in a kind of experiment in writing in real time. And the novel itself, however, ranges throughout time. So it's also, as Alysia said, it's about history. So it takes place in 2018, but it very much looks back to a period which I think is quite similar in history, a kind of echo maybe of our present, which is the early 1930s and the run up to National Socialism in Britain and in Europe and Germany. And one of the key figures from that time is Walter Benjamin. I happen to be making a film, very short film, basically an art exhibit working with an artist about Walter Benjamin's life. So he kind of appeared in my novel. I didn't really necessarily intend it to be that, but the novel actually does track a husband and wife filmmaker who are making a film about Walter Benjamin. So bit of a kind of palimpsest there, as they say. Real life and fictional life collide. And as Alysia said, I'm just going to read a very, very short abridgment of an abridgment, actually, because we were told not to read for too long. So in this particular scene, the narrator of the first half of the novel, the narration changes for the second half, is a man, male filmmaker. His name is Richard Cotter. And he's just watching and waiting for his potential lead actor who's going to read for the part of Benjamin to come home. So I'll read you a little bit. This is where you meet the actor. His name is Elliot. He's going to become Walter Benjamin, and Richard's wife, Joanna, is also in the scene. So it's London, it's 2018. Joanna appeared in the doorway on her way in from outdoors, attached by Bluetooth to her iPhone. She looked, as she often does, much younger than her 47 years, in her slim overcoat and three-quarter length trousers, which show off her racehorse ankles and terminate in beige platform Converse All-Stars. Elliot, so lovely to meet you. I've heard so much about you. I'm so glad you're up for this film. Elliot took her hand and shook it earnestly. So am I. I must have looked alarmed at this scene out of Downton Abbey. Richard, Joanna asked. Yes, we're just on our way to my study. My study was the usual Shaker disaster scene, raw wood cabinets and stony chairs upholstered in pages of script gathering dust. Elliot sat, his eyes restless. I like your study. It's very classic, like one of those Huguenot houses in Shoreditch. Yes, I find the Spartan look inspiring. It speaks to me. What does it say? I believe it's, write this bloody film, Richard, or you'll be burning me to keep warm this winter. We started the scene. In it, Benjamin is reading an essay he's in the process of writing. He's reading it to his friend, Gershom Scholem. I read the part of Scholem, and Elliot took up the narration. He began, a society that is in the process of building houses with glass walls and patios extending into drawing rooms, which are no longer drawing rooms, of private life that is openly dismantling itself. Here, man is becoming a different creature, a monster, a new angel. Eliot looked up. It's good, I said. It was true. He managed to convey the excitement of thinking. And in my mind, a door flings itself open. Film is about figures in a landscape. So said my first teacher at film school. And in a realm just behind Eliot's face, that mobile angel, unaware of the novel horrors kept in its wings, a figure stands adrift. Benjamin, in Antwerp train station before the war, buying cigarettes, or fast forward 8 years, Benjamin, asleep, bundled in his overcoat in the Drancy transit camp, where he's been dragged despite speaking perfect sibilant French. It's very difficult to write about writers. To understand their work, you have to quote from it, and so much rhetoric makes a film didactic, like watching a lecture. Yet the writer's life is in the work always, so much more than in the living, that realm they've abdicated in order to exist. Yes, the negative power of the writer is to turn their lives into art. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. There's so much in that passage. I'd like to return to this, Benjamin as this spectral presence, the difficulty in writing about writers. I highlighted that line as well, and the recursive nature of time and history. And we'll come back to some of those things. First, though, I'd like to invite Kathleen to talk a little bit about the genesis for Undersong and read a bit from your novel.
Thank you, Alysia, and thank you everyone for being here. I have loved Dorothy Wordsworth, the sister of the famous British Romantic poet William Wordsworth. I've loved Dorothy for many years, ever since I was in my early 20s, and found and read her youthful journals, her Grasmere and Alfoxden journals, in which she just wrote about her life. She wrote unpretentiously about her life, about the landscape, about the Lake District. And she wrote for her brother. She wrote so that he would, when he went away, he would come back and he would know that the bluebells had bloomed or that the mushrooms were ripe or different things that she wanted him to know, and also wanted him to be able to use in his poetry. They had a creative, I was going to say duo, but with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, they were a kind of trinity, a kind of imaginative and spiritual and poetic trinity. I always wanted to write something about her, but I thought, well, there's someone now who's had enough written about her, probably. She's very, very famous. There are buses that go to Grasmere for gingerbread and to find out about the Wordsworths every day, from spring when the daffodils bloom until the winter. Surely there's nothing left. I did go to walk where she had walked, just to sort of find out and put that impulse to rest. And when I was in Grasmere during that time, I met poet Polly Atkin, who told me that Dorothy had late journals that had never been published, journals she had written in her 50s and 60s. And I was overjoyed to be shown them by the curator of the Wordsworth Trust the very next day. Jeff Cowton showed me 11 hand-stitched journals that were stored in a refrigerated vault and have never been published. When he showed me them, and I saw Dorothy's almost illegible spidery handwriting that had lain in there for, well, it'll be her 250th birthday this coming Christmas Day, I just felt like if you had been walking along the shore and your personal hero had written a message in a bottle and it floated to your feet and you picked it up and found it, that's how I felt. And I said to Jeff Cowton, have they been transcribed? And he said, no, we don't really have the funding for that. I said, have they been photographed? Because I was returning to Canada the next day. He said, yes. And I said, well, if you would send me any of the PDFs, then I will transcribe them. And I proceeded to transcribe the years 1830 and 1834. And it was in doing that, transcribing the journals of this woman who was, at the time of writing, the age that I am now. I was in my late 50s, and now I'm 61, so it's been 3 years in the making. I realized that I wanted to write a novel about those very years in her life, about a time that has not been known about. And of course, when you write about that part of a person's life, you're also going to be including everything that went before. So it's turned out to be a novel about her relationship with William, and about about the paradise that they created. The Romantic poets created a paradise that was actually within a brutal industrial revolution, in which children were maimed and killed working in the factories in the north of England, all around the paradise that the Wordsworth created. So this book is told in 3 voices. Dorothy has a say at the end in a forgotten journal, which is my version of an actual missing journal. There is a missing journal of Dorothy Wordsworth. Nobody knows what happened to it. So I've written into the void of knowledge there, and I've recreated my literary version of what it might have been. It contains a lot of the unsaid emotional things that would have been hidden from public knowledge. And the main voice is the voice of James Dixon, who was a real person. He was a devoted factotum or handyman that the Wordsworths had with them for many decades, and who made a little cart in Dorothy's later life to wheel her around when she could no longer walk, and who was quite artistic in his own way and had a poetic sympathy, even though he was from a completely different strata of society. He grew up in a workhouse, and he was not a sophisticated person, but he's the narrator of this, one of my 3 narrators. And the 3rd narrator is an old sycamore tree in the garden of the Wordsworths in their later home at Rydal Mount. I wrote all of these voices by talking into my phone. I did not sit down at a keyboard. And while I was speaking in Dixon's voice and in Dorothy's voice into my sound files, and then transcribing them at home, I also found, while I was walking outside and doing this beside the St. Lawrence River in Montreal, that the trees, the birches and the bulrushes and the reeds and the water itself were telling me that they were brothers and sisters to the very same kinds of trees and plants and elemental forces that were in the Lake District. And they wanted to have a voice. They wanted to have a voice that transcended time and that could see forward into our own time, which is its own kind of industrial revolution and which has parallels with that time in terms of what changes our meaning for everybody, especially ordinary people who have no privilege. So I'm going to read a tiny bit from the very beginning, which is spoken in the voice of the sycamore tree. James Dixon's face moves in tiny, expressive ways. One moment, smooth as a new loaf, and the next, ruffled like wind-blown Rydal water. He was far from bald in 1816, when he first came to Rydal to work for Rotha Wordsworth. Then he had a head full of wavy hair, and he smelled like sweet baccy, a scent all the garden creatures loved, including myself, sycamore, oldest tree of our garden. That summer was a very cold one because of a faraway event that humans here did not know about, though anyone with wings or pollen knew. Volcano. Locals knew it as the year without a summer, and were it not for James Dixon's arrival, many of us living things here in the Wordsworth garden might not have survived. James noticed details you ought to if you're to be of any use to a garden. Small things, beautiful things. He worked hard and did very little harm.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I loved that story you told about listening to the trees by the St. Lawrence and them whispering that they were relatives of those in the Lake District, and certainly the natural world and the role of place and landscape is something I want to come back to because it's so pivotal in Undersong. I want to ask though, you also use the words love to talk about Dorothy Wordsworth, that you love Dorothy Wordsworth. And I think you can really see that sense of affection and like a kindred spirit. And I'm wondering, was there a difference? I mean, you've written other novels where the characters are not these figures rooted in history with backstories and so on. Was the process different this time around? Was there a sense of fear or apprehension knowing that you were dealing with someone who has a story and as you say, has been looked at from many different lenses over the years?
Yes, I mean, to decide whose voice to tell the story in came after much struggling with wanting the story to be about Dorothy, but I realized I couldn't write the whole thing in her voice because she has already done that. She has written her Scottish recollections, she's written letters and journals and many things that much more truly and powerfully than I tell us who she is. And I wanted to make a novel that would point people towards her work, not to try and reproduce it through some sort of a counterfeit, replication. So that was hard. But throughout the part that James Dixon tells, I write into unknown spaces in the documented evidence, right? I guess that's what historical novelists do. I don't really know what other novelists do, but for instance, I wouldn't write something that couldn't possibly have happened at that time because everybody knows this other thing was happening to the Wordsworths at that time through history books, So I write into undocumented spaces, and James Dixon is a almost completely undocumented space, except there are a few very tantalizing details known about him around which I could create the rest of his character. But in his telling, he does read excerpts of Dorothy's diaries, and try as I might, I could not make them. I couldn't write them in because I'm looking for her voice in these little excerpts that are nature writing. I didn't want to use her actual writing, even in these small bits, partly because it's fiction. I wasn't going to start peppering it with, pilfered real bits of her journals. But then I found an old journal that I had written when I was living in Newfoundland on the shore, and it's called A Necklace of Occasional Dreams. It's a little book that I wrote when I was in my mid-20s. And I realized everything in it came from the same, I won't say childlike, but it's almost like an ageless, but wondering, like full of wonder. I mean, like glorious wonder, like the wonder of questioning the beauty of creation, right? It was all in that tone. So I did steal little bits of that and put them in and gave them to her. So it's like my younger self could do what my current self could not do. And that's how I did that little bit of her voice.
I love this idea of kind of the undocumented spaces. So you mentioned, there aren't many details of James Dixon's life, but I suppose that this fact that he had constructed a cart for Dorothy sparked something in you. Was that kind of where you took this image of him as someone with a special understanding and empathy towards her?
Well, the very first things were that he made something called pace eggs, and that is what Easter eggs, like decorated hen's eggs, but in Cumbria they're called pace eggs. And he made them by, as far as I can gather, and I've seen them, the Wordsworth Trust actually has some. He made them by painting and then scratching or engraving into the painted egg a feather or a frond or a flower or a duck or some kind of wild animal or aspect of the landscape. And they are exquisite. They're really, really exquisite work. So I also learned that he made up little songs and he would sing them. So I knew that he was musical and that he was, he had visual artistic side and also some skills. And so those were the things that really intrigued me. And it was only later that I found out about the little cart and I saw some illustrations of it. And I knew that he actually did, when she would get tired or the cart would break, he would take her in his arms and carry her home. He was half her age. He was a young man when he met them, and she was already, quite a bit older than him. But it was these little things. And I had heard in one book about the Wordsworth's gardens, they called him an eclectic factotum. And in another very quick snippet of something that I read about when he was ministering to somebody medically. I think they had a visitor and he was helping them with their insomnia through some kind of folk remedy that he knew. There was this other aspect of him as a caring soul, you know. So I found out many different things, including the fact that he referred to himself as a favorite of fortune. He said, you know, for me to have come to the Wordsworth and worked here and been given this job makes me a favorite of fortune. I would have called the book that, except it's too old-fashioned, although Undersong is old-fashioned too. But I just love that he called himself that.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to, I'm going to put a pin in that idea because there are more questions I have about James's own creativity and kind of his place as an artist in the world. But for now, I just want to move on to Jean and ask about Walter Benjamin in Day for Night. It's different in your book. He's not so much a central character, so much as a spectral presence who kind of is this shadow collaborator hanging over the action and almost haunting Richard. And in the acknowledgements to your book, which I really loved reading kind of your reflection on how this novel of 2018 fits into the here and now of today, our pandemic times. But in any case, you talk about Walter Benjamin being kind of an analog for the citizens of Europe. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Why Benjamin? Were you haunted by Benjamin the way Richard is?
Well, it's quite difficult not to be once you know about his life and his work. I mean, before I knew much about the details of his life, his biographical life, I had read quite a few of his essays. And because they're often actually set texts on, say, you know, anthropology, sociology, certainly cultural studies, English literature, English and history. Yeah. So he gets around, Walter Benjamin. And he was very innovative as a writer, but I always found him quite incomprehensible, you know, very densely argued, very sort of, you know, intellectual, personal, subjective, objective, you know, critical idiom, all sorts of many things going on at once. And he was quite ahead of his time, I think, in that regard. He really invented what's now called creative critical writing. But I happened to spend quite a bit of time in a place which is in the far north of Spain, of Catalonia, and it's called Port de la Selva, and it's a little town, tiny little town, 14 kilometers away from an even smaller town, which is called Portbou. And in Portbou is the place where Benjamin committed suicide. And like a lot of his generation, Benjamin, of course, was a German Jewish intellectual who had been de-citizened by the Nazi government and who had fled Germany somewhat presciently in 1932. So unlike Hannah Arendt and other contemporaries, he didn't have to smuggle himself out of Germany. He kind of exiled himself from Germany. So in some ways, he had the foresight, the perspicacity to see what was coming down the line. But in other ways, he was very reluctant to leave Paris, and he left it too late. And so there's a number of lessons from history that Walter Benjamin embodies, in my view. You know, one of them is which, you know, writers are actually really oracular often. You know, if you want to know the future, you look to a writer, even a writer who's writing ostensibly about the past, you know, as Kathleen is. Somehow the understanding of history is really down to writers. You really do need to have that panoramic vision, I think, to be a serious writer, but to be able to look back, look at the present, look at the future. And we barely live in the present moment anyway. It's 3 seconds, it's gone, you know, to be able to see the synthesis of time. And Benjamin, unfortunately, he killed himself because he was really in a cul-de-sac. He was ambushed by circumstance, not necessarily by the Gestapo, who he was on the run from, but he was ambushed by bad luck. And the fact is, the Spanish border guards, who had denied him entry into Spain the day before, changed their minds the next day and said, "Oh, actually, you can go." But by then, Benjamin was dead, and the people who were traveling with him were still alive. So I find this very haunting. I mean, I guess I find the whole territory of being de-citizened, which I have been, as you know, for 20 years of my life, I've been a European citizen. I'm a very unlikely European citizen considering my origins, you know, how I was brought up in a trailer on the side of the Trans-Canada Highway, basically in a tall paper shack a lot of the time. Would I ever have dreamt of becoming a European? No, you know, but I did through acquiring British citizenship. And I just felt that nobody was writing and talking. There was a lot of too much, enough. Everybody's sick of Brexit, which is what was happening at the time in the UK, as this long, prolonged, suicidal, harakiri, you know, grotesque act, which just went on and on and on. So, you know, nobody was talking about how it felt, really, you know, how it feels, how disorienting it is in time and history to be the subject of something so egregious and so stupid, of course, at the same time, but basically so egregious. And I always grew up thinking, oh, something like the Second World War, that's not going to happen again. It was too much slaughter. You know, people have learned their lesson. And now I find myself living in an antechamber to something similar, I think, at least in Europe. And I mean, with other actors in play, Russia, China, it's not the same story, but it is the same story. So that's a really long-winded way of saying, yes, I felt haunted by Benjamin. He is the kind of exemplar. Maybe he's even got too much pathos in his life and his death. It overshadows what he wrote now, I think. His demise overshadows his work.
And you know, Kathleen talked about feeling inspired walking over those same paths as Dorothy and Grasmere. And I meant to say too, I mean, what an archivist's delight, Kathleen, to discover those journals. I mean, that's so remarkable. But Jean, did you find that as well? I mean, you talk about kind of writing in real time, having traveled to the same landscapes that Benjamin found himself in, particularly at the end of his life in the Pyrenees. And in the novel, I mean, London itself is this character, and you used the word palimpsest earlier, but the city is like a palimpsest, right? I think one of your characters says they can feel the ghosts of everyone who's ever lived there, and that's kind of informing the present. Did you find something similar too, with a connection between the land and this story?
Yeah, that was actually the subject of the art exhibition we were working on. It was called Day for Night Landscapes of Walter Benjamin. So it had the same title as my novel. And it was also about the cinematic technique of day for night, of living in a twilight zone, effectively. But yeah, I mean, Benjamin himself it's not well known, but, or it's not well explored, let's say, by biographers and so on, but he had an affinity for landscapes of the Mediterranean, specifically Naples, Capri, Ibiza, and the Pyrenees and the Mediterranean generally, because I think he felt free from his kind of Teutonic or Germanic nature, but also freed from history temporarily of the more kind of imperial forces that were gathering in the north of Europe, but which didn't constitute themselves in the same way at all, actually, in the Mediterranean. So yeah, I was very much thinking about landscape. And with that in mind, speaking of paths and the kind of research that Kathleen did, we walked over the path where Benjamin himself fled. So we did the whole thing. And it was pretty tough, you know. He was 48 at the time, but he had a heart condition and he looked 60. And I mean, I'm amazed it didn't kill him. So yeah, there is something, I think, about literally following in the footsteps, putting your feet on the ground and moving across the same land, because the land is eternal, you know, it changes, but not very much really. And you feel that ghostly passage of the human through the land by going on that kind of pilgrimage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, this is something addressed in your book and also in Kathleen's, where it's very deliberate. The sycamore tree talks about having a different type of time and almost kind of poking fun at the way that humans mark time in the form of dates and so on. And that kind of time out of time sense that we get in the natural world is quite different. I wanted to actually come back to talk about time and aging, because as someone who's kind of grappling with coming to terms with middle age myself, I found that both of these works are really exploring what it means to age and also to move between kind of different phases in the same life, right? Kathleen, you've already talked about this a little bit with Dorothy Wordsworth at a certain stage in her life, and particularly the gendered experience, right, of finding herself more physically incapacitated, feeling herself invisible, but at the same time feeling a bit liberated. And she has these kind of models of female friendship with Mary Lamb and Mary Barker, and kind of exploring what it means to be a woman in middle age or in later age. Was that on your mind as well as you were writing Undersong?
Yes, because I personally had a journal that I called the Book of Death. And I wrote it, I started it in my 50s. And I documented advertisements and things like in popular culture that that prescribed how we're supposed to think about old women or women that are getting old. And I used to observe women in the neighborhood in Montreal where I lived, especially their feet. I would notice that, you know, really old women often had astonishing feet. Sometimes the feet didn't properly go into the shoes, and there was like a mushroom coming out of the shoe, and they would be struggling. And also like the whole experience and narrative around sexuality and what happens to that as women get older. I was fascinated with it and also terrified of it because it was leading towards death. That's what aging is doing, right? So I had this sort of workbook, and I had it wrapped up in a piece of cloth with skulls all over it, and it was my Book of Death. And I would put, you know, sarcastic things in it as well, like, you know, the lengths to which women are invited to go to hide the fact that they're getting older in order to pretend that it's not happening. All of these things are absolutely ludicrous in our society. So that's what my book was grappling with. When I came to write about Dorothy, I noticed that teeth were a big deal for her. She lost some earlier, as do many people, as it was a thing with Virginia Woolf too that I had documented. You know, she was forever going on about the dentist. But Dorothy lived in a time when false teeth were quite barbaric. In fact, there's a scene in the book, which is the truth, that the corpses on the Battle of Waterloo fields, they had their teeth ripped out of their heads in order to be used for false teeth. And false teeth were also made out of other things, but that was one of the, you know, Waterloo teeth were one of the big fashion items that you could have. And so I was looking at, you know, models of false teeth of her time, and they were they had hinges on them, and I was thinking, how could somebody possibly have this in their mouth? And then I learned you didn't put it in your mouth to eat. When you ate, you just used your gums as happily as possible. But you put these things on social occasions when you wanted to appear to have teeth in your head. So all of these things, and of course, Dorothy lived in the Regency period in which the king was incapacitated by. He had strange symptoms that were just like hers, such as immobilized legs that felt like two marble pillars and couldn't move. But it was intermittent. One day you would feel like that and you couldn't get up, and the next day you'd be running over the hills. Now, why is that? So it might have been because everybody was stoned on laudanum, because painkillers like opiates, really strong opiates, you could get them under every stone. They were everywhere. Everybody in England was on these things, and they had really big effects on your overall health, and including on your mind. So that king went nuts, and the Prince Regent replaced him. And meanwhile, Dorothy was having periods of not being able to walk, of being less coherent in other people's opinions. But how to understand that, along with the repressed creativity and the buried love that she had to deal with, all these psychological forms of paralysis. So there are lots of theories as to what was actually physically wrong with her. Perhaps it was undiagnosed autoimmune or other illness that we're only just beginning to understand now, that medicine at the time didn't understand. It could have been a combination of many different things. So, but also getting old, right? So the whole notion of her getting old, I enjoyed writing around that with questions such as, does that take away from you as a human being, or does it add to who you are as a human being? And it's all very much intertwined with the female experience of getting old being its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I love in the book her triumph in scaling the highest mountain in England, right? And it's almost, she's harnessing this almost supernatural power, or willpower at least, to be able to do that.
Yeah, and she did that. That was a thing that really happened. She climbed the highest mountain in England without even realizing she had done it.
And isn't that a metaphor too? I really love this phrase that you used, Kathleen, of repressed creativity, because I think that applies very well to Joanna in Day for Night, Jean. I mean, I loved the part of the book that shows Joanna growing into a new self. And I just want to read one of my favorite passages from the novel, if I could. It's Joanna's perception of herself. So it was as if time had caught a fever. Until now, she had been living her life in the illusion that she was Joanna, before understanding that she was actually involved in some sort of relay race, and another self had just accepted the baton. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, this idea of Joanna kind of coming into her creativity, and also the way that she emerges to us in the novel. It's almost like she begins as this, I think of it as almost like a Polaroid picture, right? She's blurry as it's developing, but she becomes clearer and clearer by the end of the book.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. That's much better than I could put it myself. So let's go with that as a definitive description. Yes, that's exactly what happens. I mean, I think, I don't know, yes, I could be sociological in my answer and say, I think that's what happens to women at a certain age, and when their children are growing up and becoming independent, and something happens in the marriage, which I'm not going to spoil the story, but something happens to allow her relay self to take over. But I also think that it's kind of what happens generally when you're writing fiction about characters, that one realizes, I guess, how evanescent and emergent people really are, except we're often ground down in real life from being that, because there's, so many, I don't know, political economy, neoliberalism, anonymous authority, various control mechanisms, other people's expectations. There's pretty much everything on the table is there, working against that fact that we make ourselves anew every day, I think, on a certain level, psychically, and or we ought to be able to, or we ought to feel we can, or at least honor that reality. But when you're a writer, you literally can do that. The people really do come into focus, and the hard part is often knowing when to close the aperture, knowing when to, put the lid on the camera and say, okay, that's it. That person is now over, at least for the moment.
Yeah. It looks like I just have one more kind of question for both of you before we move into some audience questions. And that's coming back to something that Kathleen touched on in her introduction, talking about James Dixon. And I mean, that he was kind of this imaginative and poetic spirit in his own right. And in the novel, he also talks about his mother and his sister, and we learn a lot about his mother's great imagination that would perhaps rival the imagination of the Wordsworths themselves, right? But she just never got a chance. And you mentioned Virginia Woolf, and I was thinking of, her imagined sister of Shakespeare, Judith Shakespeare, in Remove One's Own, this idea that there are all these stories around us, all these poets and artists who don't get the same chance and privilege as others, right? And I was wondering if you were thinking about that, Kathleen, because one thing I think you do beautifully is, like I said, you capture this love for Dorothy, but you also capture her edges as well. The fact that she doesn't see James the way he sees her.
Yeah, about 2/3 of the way through writing the book, I sent a frantic email to my editor saying, there's stuff about Dorothy that people are not going to like, but I was hoping to write a book that would, extol her before people, that would make people love her like I do. And Lynn Henry is my editor, and she edited Annabelle and also Lost in September, and she's wonderful. I sometimes think, why aren't our editors credited on the books? Why isn't, the translator or the writer, the editor is so important. Anyway, she said to me, Kathleen, the story is mostly told through James Dixon. We don't have to love or agree with everything Dorothy does. Our sympathy has to be with James. And as long as I allowed myself to do that, then I could put Dorothy's edges in there, which I can't imagine that I could live with the book without them, because they were there and they were societal and they were, So I think for me, whoever I'm writing about, I actually do grow to love them in some way. Sometimes I go to the beach and I cry over them. I mean, I really I don't mean to sound precious about it, but you're getting inside somebody, you're understanding them maybe better than you understand the people you live with, right? You understand because you're making an effort, you're making a daily effort, hours and hours every day, to do just that, to understand their motivations, to understand why they did that really awful thing, as well as that really humane and beautiful thing. And so maybe there's some projection there, right? Because we all fall short of who we wish we were. And so part of that love for all of my characters is maybe a way of having compassion that I never had for myself. I don't know. I'm just wondering now, is this what's going on? I have no idea, but why? Yeah, we spend so much effort on understanding and having compassion, and also truly rendering our characters that, yeah, maybe if we did that in real life with the people around us, we wouldn't have to be writers anymore, because we'd be full and complete humans. instead of introspective people that squirrel ourselves away in order to try and understand life.
Well, maybe it's easier to have empathy when we're so absorbed in that world. But Jean, I was wondering too, I think in both novels, we get some of this because there's this variation in narrative voice. But in your book too, Richard's edges are apparent. He has some blind spots about the artistic life, right? I think he doesn't recognize that when he gets to hole himself up to work on his films, that Joanna's kind of picking up some of the pieces of the household. And one thing that struck me is class in your novel, that Richard thinks of himself as at a time, he's comfortable but not wealthy, and there was a time when he had no money, but meanwhile he is in part of this rarefied world. And I wonder if that was something you were taking on as you were thinking about maybe this type of character that Richard embodies. Oh, you're just on mute, Jean.
Sorry, I had to do that once in every Zoom event. You can't even eat a banana in Britain without coming up against class. And that's the problem, that is the problem. And I kind of resolutely don't think about it myself. It defines everything here, but in a way which is derivative in itself. It's meant to keep people in their place. So yes, this is a novel about two London metropolitan elite people, to quote the current Conservative government, who've weaponized that kind of social apartheid for political means. Yes, that's true. They are, but and therefore they're not the kind of character who I think commands an automatic sympathy or interest at the moment. But the fact is, it's very, very hard to do what they do, which is they don't come from, they're not, part of a dynasty. They're not, their fathers weren't, Anthony Minghella or somebody terribly well known. And so they both have come out of nowhere. It's basically, that's it in Britain. Either you're very well established, you're upper middle class professional, or everybody else has to really work hard to make it. So they are actually, I think they are representative of a kind of dynamic, creative type of person that has been enabled by the welfare state in Britain in the post-war period, but especially in the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s.
Well, we have permission to go a little bit over. I feel like we could talk all afternoon, but I am going to turn to some of the audience questions that we have. Let me just bring them up. I have a question here from an attendee that either or both of you can tackle. When you are writing creative nonfiction, where is the line between writing events or moments creatively and staying true to what actually occurred?
Good question. I'm going to cough a bit, so over to Kathleen. I'll be right back.
Okay, well, I think that, as I mentioned before, I try to write into the spaces that haven't been documented. And the best way to answer the question now for me is to give a couple of examples. So there's a shipwreck in my book. There's a shipwreck in which Dorothy and William's wife, Mary, are marooned, and everybody is afraid they're going to die. And William actually takes off all his clothes and starts to jump ship, leaving Dorothy on the ship. And Dorothy can't believe, once she discovers that he's done that, she can't believe that he's done it. So that actually happened. I've written it not as I read it. I read it as an unemotional account of, William taking his shirt off and getting ready to jump, and her realizing it after, as if everybody had thought that was a reasonable thing. But in my writing of it, I write it as if it's a very emotional thing, which I think it would have been. So that is something that really happened. But something that probably didn't really happen is that William Blake probably did not have a cameo appearance in which he came to visit Dorothy, and the light of inspiration blazed out like some kind of blue flame from each of their eyes as they encountered each other. That is something that happened in my imagination, but it could have happened. And it's just this tiny little scene that I put in the book because it could have happened. And I wanted the reader to think about another romantic poet who is not usually associated with the Wordsworths, because he was so wild, and he did very much bring the Industrial Revolution and the brutality towards ordinary working people and poor people. He brought that into his own work in a way that the Wordsworth did not. So I wanted that encounter. So it's an imaginary encounter bringing together real forces that could have happened. It's not impossible. So that's two examples of how I've used history.
I just wanted to say, Kathleen, as well, that it was really one of the pleasures of your book, almost imagining this gossip with these figures that we know so well, right? About Wordsworth, about Coleridge, Blake being just as I would imagine him to be, this blaze of light and this kindred spirit to Dorothy. And actually there was pleasure too in kind of puncturing the Wordsworth mythology, right? Jean.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say about that question is that, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is real? How do we nail down the real? How do we know that something is real? What are the hallmarks of the real? And I realize, of course, it's a preoccupation. When you read creative nonfiction or memoir, people are often, they're buying into a contract that what you're reading is based, there's a facticity to it. But there's this brilliant short book by Masha Gessen, who is an American-Russian commentator. And in it, Gessen, it's called Surviving Autocracy. And in it, Gessen writes about the plasticity of the real. And the fact is that sometimes things that happen, even as they're happening, even as you know they are real, they are too kind of phantasmagoric to really take them on board. And you have to wait for a kind of afterwardsness to really understand what happened. So the locus of the real is, I think, something which is ambiguous, really. But I also think, just as Kathleen just said, that as soon as you're writing something, even if it's based on something that actually happened that's fairly well documented, there's a process in any artistic form, which is that you render it and it becomes something different. The reality has already happened, that ship has sailed. So that anything you present, even if it is in nonfiction and you're writing a fact-based nonfiction book, you're reorienting the kind of, the structure of reality as you do it as a writer. That's what you're doing.
Before we go, can I just ask, what's next for each of you? Are you going to stay within the bonds of history? Are you thinking in a different creative direction for the future? Jean, why don't we start with you?
Well, yes, I've just written a pretty big long book, which is nonfiction, and that's about it's about living in the now, in the Anthropocene, I guess. Yeah, in the land, what we're doing to the land, climate change. It's wild places. So that's what's on the plate next.
Yes, that it sounds very, very apt. And especially in these pandemic times when I think we've all been reflecting on time and nature in a new way. Kathleen.
Yes, my next book is about the land as well. In particular, it's about a mountain that I'm visiting many, many times. And it's going to be about what that mountain knows, both sociologically, philosophically, artistically, and through time.
Oh, I look forward to both of these books. And I have to say, what a privilege and delight it has been to talk to both of you. I could talk to you for so much longer, but our time is up. It's 2:00, and I thank you so much for joining us and for engaging in this conversation. Again, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, and I want to echo that as well. I had this idea of inviting Kathleen. Of course, you've been here at Wild Riders before, and I read your book, and it's such a beautiful book. So really, really a great delight to have you back at the festival. I wish it was in person, but Zoom works whenever. So yeah, a real joy to have you back. And Jean, I said that I was introduced to your books, having had them been sent to our office, and finally persuaded, I needed to discover this work, and really enjoyed your book as well. A really immensely interesting and deeply thoughtful book. And I'm just going to flip them up to the audience to see, and encourage you to go out and purchase the books of these wonderful writers. A fascinating discussion. Thank you, Alysia. I'm going to book you now for next year as moderator. You were fantastic. So really made this a really wonderful afternoon for us. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, audience members, for spending this time with us. We have one more event of our festival. It's on at 3:00 this afternoon. It's on mentorship, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with Evelyn Lau, Susan Scott, and Isabella Wang. So yes, thank you very much, and we'll end our session now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Alysia.
Bye.